Okay, great. Welcome to the second part of today's sort of mini job market conference. We're very pleased to have Fernando Arce present his paper on private over borrowing under sovereign risk. Fernando, same rules apply. You have 30 minutes, 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. I'll interrupt you a few times with questions on the chat. If anybody's new to the audience that just came in, you can put your questions on the chat, clarifying questions in the first 30 minutes, deeper questions in the last 10 minutes or so. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you very much for having me, Matteo. I'm Fernando Arce from the University of Minnesota, and today I'll be telling you about my job market paper, Private Over Borrowing Under Sovereign Risk. So this research is motivated by the recent experience of the Spanish debt crisis of 2012, specifically the road that led to that financial crisis. And in particular, in the decade preceding the crisis, Spain was characterized by having a high level of private borrowing. This is external private borrowing, and a low level of public debt and spreads on that public debt that were near zero. This all came to a halt when there started being a contraction on the private borrowing side. The Spanish banks had a harder time rolling over their debts, especially once the mortgage boom that they were financing collapsed. And this contraction of the banking sector eventually spread to the public sector that started bailing out these banks, and eventually the spreads on public debt started increasing. And this is what this data here is trying to convey. So on the x-axis, you have time from the creation of the euro area until 2015. And on the y-axis here on the left, you have the net foreign liability positions of the private sector and the public sector. So the private sector is in blue and the public sector is in red. And on the dotted red line, you have the average interest rate spread paid on public debt. So as you can see, in the decade preceding the 2008 crisis, these spreads were close to zero. You could see the boom in external private debt, while public debt remains low. After 2008, the amount of private debt that Spain issues starts stabilizing and the level of public debt starts increasing. So that's the spread. And then eventually you observe this very symmetric evolution of private and public positions in terms of debt, of external debt. You see that the private debt collapses, this is the deleveraging, and the public debt increases, and this coincides exactly with a spike on the interest rate spread paid on public debt. And the reason for this symmetry is not necessarily a mystery. We know that both the fiscal sector in Spain and the central bank were actively purchasing liabilities owned by the Spanish private sector via the central bank, for instance, through asset purchases programs, and the fiscal sector through direct restructurings of its financial sector, actually through two rounds of financial restructuring. And we also know that this eventually led to a sovereign debt crisis in 2012 that only culminated after there were reassurance from the European Central Bank about the stability of the euro area. So the purpose of this research is going to try to develop a quantitative model, a theory model that can quantitatively speak to this data, to both parts of this data, that is the buildup that led to the crisis, but also the crisis years where we observe this symmetric evolution of private and public positions and this increase in the spreads. So what this paper will argue is that private borrowing in Spain before the crisis was socially excessive. And through the lens of my model, I will have a clear definition of what is the socially optimal level of private borrowing and why Spain was above it. I will argue that this excessive private borrowing increased the frequency and magnitude of sovereign debt crisis because it increased the possibility that the government would want to provide a fiscal bailout to the private sector. And it's these fiscal bailouts that will lead to the sovereign debt crisis. Now, because the theory that I will propose will be quantitatively consistent with the Spanish data, the model will allow me to measure a few things. The first is it would allow me to measure how much private debt was above what was socially optimal. I will estimate that on average, 5% of GDP was the value of private debt that was above what was socially optimal in the lead up to the crisis. I can also quantitatively measure the effect of this excessive private borrowing. I can, for instance, say that this excessive private borrowing increased the annual probability of experiencing a financial crisis that I will define through the lens of my model as an episode of contraction and a sudden deleveraging on private debt. The probability of that event happening annually increased by 2.4 percentage points due to the debt being above what is socially optimal. And I can also quantify the effect that this excessive private borrowing had on increasing the spreads, the interest rate spreads paid on public debt. Specifically, at the peak of the crisis, Spain was paying 3.8 percentage points more on its interest rates on its public debt than would otherwise be the case if Spain had borrowed at the socially optimal level. The key policy implication of this paper is going to be that a regulator that is setting prudential policies, that is restrictions on the amount of private borrowing that the country can do externally, should be more careful in a country where sovereign risk is an issue than would otherwise be the case, relative to a situation in which the government can issue debt with full commitment. Prudential policies should be extra careful. And my model will actually give me a notion of how much more careful the regulator should be in such a country. A corollary of this policy implication is that in countries where sovereign risk is an issue, the financial authorities that are regulating the private sector should also take a look at the state of public debt when deciding how restrictive the prudential policy should be on the private sector. So what do I actually do in this model? So I will propose a model where there will be two types of international debt. There will be private debt, and private debt will be subject to a credit friction. Specifically, it will be constrained to be a fraction of the market value of income. Public debt will be another asset, again, issued internationally, will be controlled by the government, and the government will have the ability to strategically default on this debt, understanding that there will be penalties in case of default. I will solve two versions of this model. A baseline version, or if you want a competitive version, where a continuum of competitive households will control the issuances of private debt and will be regulated by a government who can tax and transfer resources to these households. And this government will also control the public debt and will make the default decisions on the public debt as well. I will also solve a normative version that I will be calling throughout the paper the socially planned version. In this version, there is a social planner that controls both stocks, aggregate stocks of private and public debt for the country as a whole, and makes both borrowing decisions. But crucially, this planner will face exactly the same constraints as the agents in the previous version. That is, when using the private bond, it will have to respect exactly the same collateral constraints, the same credit frictions that the households were facing, and will also lack commitment and have the ability to default on the public debt and suffer exactly the same penalties as the government in the baseline version. Comparing these two versions of my model, I'll be able to talk about overborrowing. That is, for instance, I will find that there is higher private borrowing on the baseline version of my model relative to the socially planned version. This is what I mean by overborrowing. The baseline version borrows more than the socially planned version. I will show that this excessive private borrowing in the baseline version will also increase the probability of a financial crisis that I will define in my model through as a contraction of the current account of the private sector of more than one standard deviation. This financial crisis, I will show as well, that will incite in the government, and the government will endogenously respond to this crisis by providing bailouts to the private sector. That is, the government will borrow from abroad using public debt and transfer those resources to the households. The government will find this response to be desirable, exposed, that is, once the crisis actually happens. This government response, in turn, will increase the amount of public debt and will also increase the frequency of sovereign debt crisis, and will eventually be priced in also on the spreads the government pays in the baseline version. And throughout the paper, I'll be comparing this baseline and socially planned version to derive these comparisons. I will show as well, theoretically, that a government that has access to taxes on international private debt that can take the form of capital control in their easiest implementation would be able to implement the socially planned version of my model. And I will also try to give you a notion about how these taxes would have looked like during the crisis years.
Fernando, we have a clarifying question from Harry that, if I'm interpreting correctly, is asking, what is the currency composition of the debt?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question. So this will be a real model. There will be all of the assets will be denominated in real terms, specifically in the tradable good, will be a tradable and non-tradable goods. And the reason why I'll be taking this position is because most of the debt issued by Spain was issued both through the private and public sector, was issued in euros, that is not something that was necessarily under control of Spanish authorities, given that it's the European Central Bank that controls the nominal value of the euro. So in a way, this model is akin to an external borrowing model of a country that issues debt in dollars, an emerging economy. So that's the currency composition of both debts. All debts will be denominated in real terms in euros.
And I will pass on a second question from Sergio, who's asking you to clarify what is the externality, the inefficiency that is not being internalized by the households that leads to overborrowing in the competitive equilibrium.
This will be a key thing of the model, and I will be hammering this point over and over again. But yeah, in a nutshell, there will be a pecuniary externality that is common with collateral constraints that will be driving this distinction. But I'll go back to this point over again. So I'll defer this question for a little bit. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll go briefly on the related literature. The model contributes to the literature on sovereign debt and private debt by introducing private debt that is inefficient, even during sovereign defaults. It also contributes to the literature that deals with financial crisis and government bailouts by introducing bailouts that are financed with long-term debt that can potentially be defaulted on. And it's a quantitative model that also speaks to the doom loop literatures that is interested in this connection between crisis in the financial sector and crisis in the sovereign sector. The model has a shortcoming that only focuses on one of the legs of this loop, that is how crises that originate in the private sector lead to a crisis in the sovereign sector. But in that way, it complements models that focus on the other direction of this crisis that originate in the sovereign sector and how they spread to the financial sector. And in this channel, it will provide a quantitative answer to how this crisis can spread from the private sector to the public sector. Okay, but let's go to the model. So as I said, the model will be a small open endowment economy. There will be two goods, tradables and non-tradables. All debts, both private and public, will be denominated in units of tradables. As a result, there will be a key relative price in this model, which will be the relative price of non-tradables. That will also be referred to as a real exchange rate through the Nesselman model. And it will be key to understanding this externality that will be driving the disagreement between the baseline and the socially planned versions of the model. There will be three exogenous shocks. There's going to be an income shock to the endowment of tradables. And there's going to be two sorts of financial shocks that are going to affect the private sector. One that affects directly the collateral constraint that will be denoted by kappa, and one that will affect the share of private debt that is defaulted on each period. This last shock is not necessary for the mechanism of the model. The model goes through perfectly if we assume that there is no private default at all. But I've added it for completeness. There will be three agents in this model: the government, who will make strategic decisions and will be benevolent; a continuum of competitive households; and a continuum of risk-neutral foreign lenders who will price the assets issued by both the households and the government to maximize their own profits. The timing within the period will be as follows. First, the exogenous shocks are going to realize, the three exogenous shocks. Then the government will make the default on public borrowing decisions, the taxing decisions, strategically, that is taking into account how its borrowing and default decisions are going to affect the decisions of the households. Then the households will make their own consumption and borrowing decisions competitively. And then finally, the lenders will price the assets issued by both of these agents competitively, and the markets will clear. That's the timing within the period. The richness of the model comes from the asset structure. So I'll talk a little bit more about it. The public debt will be denoted by big L. It will be long-term. Specifically, it will be a perpetuity with an exponential decay delta. It will be strategically defaultable, as the government will choose period by period whether or not it wants to repay, understanding what are the consequences if it decides not to pay back. And it would be issued at a price big Q. Private debt will be denoted by B, and the aggregate stock of it will be denoted by big P. It will be shorter term. It will be one period. As I said, a fraction pi of it will be defaulted on each period. This fraction will be exogenously drawn every period, drawn from an AR1 distribution. And as a result, it will be issued at a spread as well over the risk-free rate, therefore at price little q. But crucially, it will be subject to a collateral constraint. That is, the market value of the debt issued today, QB prime, has to be smaller than a fraction kappa of the market value of current income. That is the income of the market value of the endowment of tradables and the endowment of non-tradables. This collateral constraint is common in the literature, and it reflects the fact that that non-tradables played a big role in the Spanish financial crisis, specifically through the fact that the banks, who were the ones driving the increase in private debt, were financing a construction boom in Spain, and this type of constraints are common in mortgage loans. Another interesting aspect that this collateral constraint will have is that the evolution of this price, this real exchange rate, will also mimic what we observe in the real exchange rates during sudden stop crisis. That is, when the economy suffers a crisis, this price of non-tradables, this real exchange rates, will drop, and this will exacerbate the crisis, exactly as we observe in sudden stop crisis. So that's the form of the private debt and the public debt. So let's go through the timing of the model. The government plays first. Once the government wakes up, it observes the state of the economy that is characterized by the exogenous states and the two endogenous states, the level of private debt and the level of public debt. The government then has to decide whether or not it wants to default on the public debt, and if it decides to repay its public debt, how much public debt to issue. The default decision is binary, either repayment or default, and there is a value associated with defaulting and with repaying. This is taken directly from the John Gosowitz literature. The government has to satisfy a period budget constraint that will pin down how much the households are being taxed or transferred to. If the government decides to default, the household's tax is 0. But if the government decides to repay, the government has access to international credit markets, and therefore the households will receive either a positive or a negative transfer, depending on whether or not the government decides to increase the stock of public debt or decrease the stock of public debt. The shape of this function is based on the fact that this public debt, as I said, is long-term. It's a perpetuity with exponential decay delta. And the government will internalize the effect of its borrowing decisions on the price that it faces on this public debt. So when these transfers are positive, I'll be talking about bailouts through the lens of a model. That is, the government is borrowing from abroad and transferring a positive amount of resources to the households. But also regularly, this transfer will be negative, meaning that the government will be taxing the households and reducing its stock of public debt, that is, repaying its debt. And the government needs to do this from time to time, otherwise nobody will lend them any money. So these transfers would be the key link between the government and the households. And this price of public debt will be decided by the lenders, by the best response of the lenders, given government and households policies. The households play after the government once the government has made its default and borrowing decisions, and have to decide how much private debt they're going to issue, their individual private debt, that's why it's denoted by little b, and their consumption of tradables and non-tradables. They have to respect their budget constraint. That is, they have to decide how much to consume of both goods. They have to repay a fraction 1 minus pi of their initial stock of private debt. And for that, they can use their endowments, they can issue new private debt, and they can also use the transfers they receive from the government. If they decide to issue new private debt, they have to respect the collateral constraint that I mentioned before. The market value of new private debt has to be smaller than a fraction kappa of the market value of current income. Now, crucially, the households are part of a continuum and are competitive. So they will be taking the aggregate loss of motions of aggregate policies as given. This includes specifically the real exchange rate, which will be the key which will be key for the key externality that is driving the disagreement between the baseline and the socially planned version. The fact that this price of non-tradables is inside the collateral constraint will lead to this pecuniary aggregate demand externality, and therefore this excessive borrowing on the private sector. But the households are also taking as given the functions, the transfer functions, and the government policies, both current and future government policies. And this is going to be a key innovation of the paper, and where an additional interaction effect will characterize the mechanism of the paper. The households' decisions are going to not only affect this, the value of their collateral, but also are going to affect future government policies. That is, future default decisions and future borrowing decisions. And the households are not going to internalize this when they make their own borrowing decisions. And that's going to create another set of disagreements between the baseline and the socially planned version of the model. So other than that, the equilibrium is a standard. Government solves these problems, government optimizes, households optimize, the lenders are pricing both private and public debt, and the markets are clearing. I will, since I've defined equilibrium, I can tell you a little bit about how do I characterize this equilibrium. And the key thing to characterize the equilibrium here is this price of non-tradables, this real exchange rate. That in equilibrium, it will be pinned down by the intratemporal optimality condition of the households. The households will equalize the marginal rates of substitution between tradables and non-tradables. And what is important to note is that in equilibrium, this price of non-tradables will be an increasing function of the aggregate consumption of tradables, of the tradable endowments. That is, the more tradable endowments, tradables you are consuming, the more the value of an extra unit of non-tradables increases. That's what's going to drive, that's what's going to make this real exchange rate be an increasing function of the aggregate consumption of tradables. The specific shape of this function is going to depend on the functional forms that I make, forms assumptions that I make for the utility function. I will be choosing a CES between tradables and non-tradables. But what matters is that it's an increasing function of the aggregate consumption of tradables. And this is the thing that the households are not going to take, are going to take as given, and that the social planner who controls aggregates will potentially be able to take into account when making its own borrowing decisions. And that's what I will be presenting next. I will contrast the baseline model that I presented you before with the socially planned version that looks exactly the same. Instead of the government, you just have a planner who makes all of the borrowing decisions. It faces exactly the same three shocks, aggregate shocks, and the same two endogenous states. It starts with an endogenous level of private debt and an endogenous level of public debt as well. And contrary to the households, this agent does control aggregates. So it will choose big B, that is the aggregate level of private debt, and will take into account how its borrowing decisions are going to affect this price of non-tradables, using exactly the same function that, using exactly the same characterization of the price of non-tradables that we found on the baseline version of the model. And finally, the foreign lenders are going to be optimally pricing those assets. So now, why do these baseline and socially planned allocations differ? This is the key mechanism of the model. Well, as I've said, households are making borrowing decisions that are individually optimal from their perspective, but are ignoring two general equilibrium effects. The first one is the one that I keep alluding, is this pecuniary externality. That is the fact that the prices, the collateral value depends on prices. Specifically, what happens is the following. The households borrow too much in the current period, which means that in order to repay that, future consumption, that is consumption the next period, is lower. And this reduces the value of collateral tomorrow. And this small reduction in the value of collateral tomorrow increases the probability that the collateral constraint for the private bond will bind. As a result, more borrowing today increases the probability of a binding constraint. The planner internalizes this and decides to borrow less. And as a result, the planner's collateral constraint binds less frequently than the collateral constraint, the baseline economy. This is the first general equilibrium effect that is common in the macroprudential literature. In the macroprudential literature, but the key part of the model is that this externality is going to interact with another externality, which is how this borrowing, this excessive private borrowing decision is going to interact with the government public debt. Specifically, what's going to happen is that this excessive private borrowing is going to increase the cost of public debt. That is, it's going to increase the spread paid on public debt. Why is this the case? Because higher private borrowing, as I said, is going to make the collateral constraint binding more frequently because of the mechanism I described before. I will show you that when the collateral constraint is binding, it will be desirable for the government to increase public debt and bail out the private sector, that is, transfer a positive amount of resources to the households. But this response will in turn increase public debt and therefore increase also the frequency of sovereign defaults. And importantly, the lenders are going to internalize this. the lenders are going to internalize that lending to this government that keeps regularly bailing out this private sector is going to be more risky than lender to the planner, who encounters this crisis less frequently. And as a result, will charge the planner a lower interest rate than what they charge the government in the baseline version of the model.
Fernando, you have a question from Jesse Schrager asking you if you can clarify the role of the market value of the bond versus the face value of the bond entering the constraint.
That wouldn't change. It wouldn't change much. Everything will go through if I just put B prime instead of it.
Sure. Then I have a follow-up question. Doesn't the pecuniary externality rely on having a price in the constraint, namely the bond price versus the face value, or not?
No. The pecuniary externality relies on having the price of non-tradables in the right-hand side of the constraint. Not the Q. Okay. So as promised.
Sorry, I have one last one from Sebnem, who was asking you whether the capital control is static or counter-cyclical.
It will be dynamic. It will not be static. I haven't introduced it yet. It's coming. It's coming right after I finish the explanation of the mechanism. But yeah, you will see it will be a state-dependent tax on capital controls that will take the form that will eventually look counter-cyclical. But we can talk a little bit about it coming next. Okay, so yeah, the only part of the mechanism that I haven't explained is why is it optimal for the government to bail out the households when the credit constraint bans? Well, imagine that you are the government, and currently, because of a low endowment, for instance, the collateral constraint is binding this period. What a bailout is going to do, that is, if you borrow from abroad and transfers those resources to the households, is going to increase the consumption of tradables of the households. The households are going to increase their consumption of tradables because they are not on the regular equation. The collateral constraint is binding, so they will use these extra funds to consume. And since aggregate consumption is going to increase, that's going to increase the price of non-tradables and therefore the value of the collateral. And that is going to allow the households themselves to borrow more. So public debt is going to lead to an increase in private debt as well. And this second effect is going to increase consumption even more. This is what's going to make bailouts particularly attractive when the collateral constraint is binding, and why the government will provide them when there is a financial crisis. Now, this response is optimal, and it will also happen in the socially planned version of the model. The problem is that in the baseline version, it happens too frequently, and that's what's going to lead to the higher incidence of sovereign debt crisis. Okay, so that's the summary of the mechanism. In the baseline version, private debt is higher. This leads to a more frequently binding collateral constraint, which I will call a financial crisis in the private sector. And the response to this financial crisis is going to increase the level of public debt through the bailouts, and that's going to lead to more sovereign defaults. So that's the mechanism in summary. As I said, I show theoretically on the paper that if you write down a model where the government has an additional instrument, a tax on that takes the form of a capital control, if you want, a tax on private debt that will be state dependent as well, then the government will be able to implement the social planners problem. That is the baseline version. This version will give you will decentralize the social planner version with these taxes. This is not the only instrument that you can assume. You could also assume a reserve requirement that's perhaps more realistic in the real world, but we can talk more about that if you have questions at the end. And let's go to the quantitative analysis. So I'll calibrate the model to the lead up to the crisis from 1999 to 2011. I discretize the processes for income and for the shocks. And then I will run two simulations to simulate the 2012 Spanish debt crisis. So the calibrated parameters, I calibrate 6 parameters. I will be targeting the average level of the total level of external debt and the average level of private debt, as well as the spread paid on public debt and the standard deviation of each of the 6 moments. So the model does a good job on most of these parameters. The only one that it has a harder time is on the standard deviation of private debt. As I said, relative to the social planner, then once I've calibrated the baseline version of the model to the pre-crisis years, I use those parameters to solve the social planner version of the model, and I compare both of them at the ergodic distribution, at the respective ergodic distribution. And this is what this table is summarizing. As you can see, on average, private debt is 5% higher on the baseline version of the model relative to the social plan version. This is the 5% that I said in the beginning. I also compute the annual probability of experiencing a financial crisis, defined as a contraction of more than one standard deviation in the current account of the private sector. That happens more frequently in the baseline version relative to the social planner, and I compute that probability. The defaults on sovereign debt, on public debt, are also more frequent on the baseline version, and as a result, there are also welfare gains from moving from the baseline version of this model to the socially planned version of this model, and I compute them in terms of the equivalent increase in consumption, permanent increase in consumption that will deliver the same welfare gains. I then run two exercises that I will briefly touch. I will feed to the model exogenous shocks taken from the data from 2008 to 2015 to try to compute the model dynamics and see if they can match the data. So two of the shocks, I observe it directly from the data. The other
Fernando,
one,
just a reminder, you should be wrapping up.
Yes, sorry, I will just present this exercise and then I'll go to the conclusion. So I will feed in the shocks. I will back out by maximum likelihood is the last shock that I don't observe in the data, and I will let the model endogenously create the responses to the financial debt crisis. So here in black, you have what happened in the data. This is private debt, public debt, and the spreads. You see the collapse in private debt in 2012 and the increase in public debt and the spike on the spreads. In red, you have the baseline version of the model. And in blue, you have what the social planner would have done faced with the exact same shocks. So you can see that the baseline version replicates the bailouts, but the planner is able to completely avoid the crisis through a combination of both lower private debt and lower public debt. In the interest of time, I will skip the second exercise. It's just the same exercise, except that I force everybody to issue the same amount of public debt. And this is where I compare the policy recommendations. This is also an additional result that you can find also on the paper. But to conclude, this is a simple model of how financial crisis in the private sector can lead to sovereign debt crisis. It's a quantitative model that allows me to show that the way it works is higher excessive private borrowing leads to financial crisis. It is optimal for the government to respond to this crisis with bailouts, but this response in turn increases the probability that the government will default on its public debt. The model is quantitatively consistent with the Spanish data, and it allows me to measure the degree of private overborrowing before the crisis, estimated to be around 5% of GDP, and it allows me to measure the effect on the probability of a financial crisis, the effect, how that excessive borrowing increased the probability of a financial crisis, and its effect on the spreads paid into, specifically the spread paid at the peak of the crisis in 2012. And as I said, the policy recommendations is that if sovereign risk is an issue in a country, then more restrictive macroprudential policies have to be. Sorry that I went over a few minutes, but I'll be very happy to take any questions you have.
Fantastic. So let me open it for Q&A. I have Sebnem first and then Hari. So Sebnem, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Very nice paper. So two questions. So the first is on this optimal policy, the tax. So I mean, obviously, because everything is international borrowing here, it is a capital control. But then you said, it can be a macroprudential through reserve requirements. That's actually how it works in real life. In fact, Spain has to do that because Spain cannot put a capital control, and how it works in Spain is the banks borrow and banks intermediated that funds to the corporate sector, right? So, which is great. I'm fine with that real life interpretation, but the real life policy debate right now is exactly that policy leaks, right? I mean, so for that policy to be fully successful, the entire capital flow should be intermediated through the banking system, which is not the case for many emerging markets. So how do you do the tax on a private firm that is borrowing directly overseas, right? That is the big question. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of applicability? And my second question is, no, okay, I'm not going to ask my question because you answered that already now, I realize.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a very interesting comment. So yes, the choice of the tool and the problem of leakages is very important in this literature, and I have other papers with other authors in which we deal a little bit with those issues. Specifically, there are an array of potential tools that could be available for a regulator. As I said, some of them are not existing. These capital controls would not be. one of them would potentially be a reserve requirement. In another paper, we even consider the possibility of how international reserves themselves could be used as a potential macroprudential tool. And how they could, so this would be a tool that's not necessarily directed towards banks and could potentially offset the borrowing that is done by some of the private companies. So that's potentially how we could deal with the problem of leakages, by having a policy that's not directly affecting the banks. So I'll be very happy to.
So, but wait a minute. So reserves, then you are using reserve not to affect the exchange rate, which obviously you don't have in a real model. You are using the reserves as a transfer. So you are bailing out and using your reserves. You are saying as an alternative.
So you're absolutely right. We don't have nominal exchange rates, but we do have this real exchange rate, and you are using the reserves to actually affect this real exchange rate in exactly the same way that we see in the model. You would actually accumulate the reserves in boom times when the economy is booming and the private debt is high, and then you would deplete them during a recession to appreciate this real exchange rate that is depreciating too fast during the sudden stopping. So in that way, even though you're absolutely right, we don't have nominal exchange rates, we are making the real exchange rate, this price of non-tradables, move exactly in the same direction. That's what you use the reserves for. You save in the good times and then you deplete them in the bad times. Thank you very much.
Great, and then I have a question from Hari. Why don't you go ahead, Hari?
Yeah, it's a nice presentation. I just wanted to know how these borrowing constraints like firms and households, mostly the emerging and developing economies, they have these borrowing constraints. How this model you will fit into that? I mean, have you ever have you done with that, or it is not relevant for that?
No, it's absolutely relevant for emerging economies. These models were originally developed to model sudden stops in Latin American countries. So if you want to think about this collateral constraint is more based on the friction related to the issues of housing. That's why it has non-tradables in the collateral constraint. Now, what is true is that you could potentially think that in emerging economies, there are additional financial frictions in the model. So for instance, this model is isomorphic to a model in which banks are lending to households subject to this collateral constraint. And then the banks have unrestricted access to international credit markets. But if you don't think that applies to emerging markets, you could, for instance, use a constraint like the one Matteo has on his paper with Xavier Gabet and on the banking sector, and that would add an additional constraint to this that would only affect the intermediaries, the financial intermediaries. And that model, if you drive that constraint to zero, will converge to this one. So that's how potentially you could model emerging markets if you want to add frictions on the financial sector, on the intermediaries who are borrowing for these households.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry.
Let me see if there are any last questions. And if not, we have a question. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Hano. I'll ask a quick question that's a little bit outside of the model, perhaps. But if you look at the data, you see that in the Eurozone, there was this quite dramatic convergence of interest rates, especially if you compare periphery to core countries, sort of in anticipation of the creation of the euro, and then after that continued until, I guess, 2007. Do you think this played a role in the crisis, and how would that fit into your model? Is there perhaps an additional bailout at the Eurozone level that's missing from your analysis?
Thank you very much for this question. That's definitely one of the motivations of the paper. Specifically, what the part that deals with the fact that the interest rate paid on public debt before the crisis was very low relative to Germany. That's actually what I use for the risk-free rate in the model, and I calibrate the model to the pre-crisis years where that interest rate is very low. So I'm definitely including in the model that I want the model to generate this very low interest rate environments in the pre-crisis years, and simultaneously afterwards generate the spike in spreads similar to the ones that we observed in the data. So the model doesn't necessarily speak to the how this is a European problem, but it does speak to the fact that you can simultaneously have these low spread environments and this spike on interest rate spreads that we observed in the data without necessarily assuming something additional. That's the only way I feel like Neymar can speak to that literature.
Thanks, Fernando.